And that's an amazingly enabling thing, even if you're not a software developer. Because what it means is you have a lot of flexibility in how you acquire support for the open source technologies that you're using. Because if the company or the group or the person who brings you that software and introduces it into your life or into your business and makes it part of your life cycle doesn't behave in a way that is supportive of your needs, you always have the option of becoming a developer yourself to enhance, extend, maintain, and repair that software, or of paying somebody else to do it for you. This is why we live in a world where you can buy support for the Red Hat Linux distribution from Red Hat, or from IBM, or from HP, or derivatives of it from Oracle and from other people, is because of this licensing structure. It's also the thing that allows a high school student in Spain to have the ability to work on, evolve, contribute patches to, and become a substantial and significant contributor to an open source project. I will admit that the first time I was hanging out on the Debian IRC channel and saw someone announce that they were celebrating their 15th birthday that day, and I realized that this was somebody who maintained a couple of core fundamental library packages that are on every Debian system on the planet, it gave me pause. Until I realized that if the internet had existed then, I would have been that guy. Because that's exactly what I had been doing in my own little way with my own little 1802-based microprocessor system in my basement at that point in my history. And somehow I managed to sort of calm back down about it and decide in the end that that really is pretty cool. And there is this sort of ultimate notion that if upstream behaves really unacceptably, the license always gives us the ability to fork, to make a copy of the code, put it in a different place, and proceed with development from there. That's what just happened with the LibreOffice fork from OpenOffice. It's the thing that happened a few years ago very successfully when X386 got bogged down and went into a mode where it was not accepting contributions from substantial contributors, and out of that came the reinvigoration of the X consortia and the creation of freedesktop.org, and the fact that we now have whizzier, cooler technology on Linux desktops than other platforms. So what's the impact of this whole community thing, this whole collaborative process? What is it that makes this such a strong economic and technical mover? Well, it's that innovation comes from strange places. And what I mean by that is a lot of times the really novel ideas don't come from people who are being paid to search for that idea. I've given keynotes at Posscon in the past where I talked about the fact that the Wright brothers weren't in the aircraft industry being paid to work on innovating the airplane. They were bicycle guys who did this as a hobby and as a passion. It was the result of their innovation that created an aircraft industry. And they're actually a wonderful example to study both pro and con, because they also were sort of evil in the way they handled patents, but that's a whole different talk. And because of my interest in rocketry, I love also to point to Robert Goddard, who experimented with rockets in his backyard as a hobby passion. And very much like open source developers today, once he had a little bit of success, he got some grant money so that he could afford to spend more time playing with it. And eventually it became something that he was employed to work on full time. And that mirrors very closely the stories of many of the open source developers I know, who began by scratching some personal itch, who got really good at scratching that class of itch, and the next thing they knew, they were professional back scratchers being paid by somebody to do that work full time. And the emergence of this class of internet-enabled communities of developers and users enabled by open access and open standards is really what has accelerated the adoption of open source in the whole PC industry. And I firmly believe that companies like HP who have been successful operating in this space are successful because they've learned how to productively participate as citizens in this collaborative development process in these open source communities. And when I talk about success, it's really, this is something I firmly believe, and it's backed up by real numbers. I promised you I wouldn't bore you with industry stats or something, but it is literally true that for more than a decade, HP has sold more Linux systems, more servers that are being used to run Linux than anybody else in the world, and that's a trend that continues. And when we look at the fraction of all of those servers that we sell that run Linux today, it's a really impressive number. I'm not allowed to give it to you, but it's a really impressive number. So let's talk a little bit about this whole Linux distributions thing. I've talked a little bit about this concept of community, this concept of collaborative development. How many of you, out of curiosity, are running Linux on at least one system that belongs to you today? What's wrong with the rest of you? Oh, that's why you're here. Okay, yeah, we'll figure it out. If you're running Linux, you understand, I hope, that installing Linux gives you a lot more than just a kernel. In fact, in general, it gives you a lot more than what we traditionally in the IT industry thought of as an operating system. I will never forget the day a CIO of a substantial company expressed great surprise to me on discovering that the web server actually came with the operating system. He was accustomed to having to pay extra for that. He was fascinated by the idea the mail transport system was part of the operating system. They didn't have to pay extra for a mail handling infrastructure. Installing Linux gives you a lot more than just a kernel. And in fact, the role of a distribution is to select, aggregate, and integrate software for use together as a whole system. And one of the things that differentiates the various Linux distributions is the approaches that they take to selecting that software, how well they do or don't integrate it, and what sort of, slice of the application's ecosystem they're capable of serving as a consequence of those choices. And I think it's fair to say that particularly when we're talking about traditional Linux distributions, the kind of things you would go pick one of to put on a server or on a notebook or on our desktop, quoting one of my university professors who I really detested, they're exactly the same but different. And what I mean by that is that all Linux distributions have a set of common attributes, but it's the little things that make them different that are the things you end up having to focus on if you want to pick one. So what is a Linux distribution and how does it happen? It's this idea of a completely integrated deliverable, something that you can install, something you can use, something you can extend and enhance and run, that's put together by a distributor taking components from the upstream development communities, whether that's the Linux kernel development community, the X development community, the GNOME Foundation, the KDE Foundation, the whole list, the Eclipse Foundation, all these places where developers come together to work collaboratively on free software, and they bring that together and aggregate it into something that's then distributed to users, making it easy for them to install, update, and manage that operating system. Companies like HP participate at lots of different levels in this process. We employ people who are upstream developers of various pieces of open source technology. We work very closely with a number of Linux distributors to make sure that the things that we have developed and the enablement that matters for our hardware and for our software businesses are all thought of in their process of deciding what to include in their distributions, which is all part of trying to make sure that we don't have to keep doing the same work over and over again. And then we work, of course, very directly with users to try and help ensure that the Linux distributions they choose and run on our hardware and with our value-added software components all work well for them, and that problems that they have get fed back into the community and action gets taken. When we think about the ecosystem out there of traditional Linux distributions, I actually find it useful sometimes to break it down in this kind of a coarse taxonomy. There really are sort of a small number of key places that a company like HP needs to go to in order to ensure that the technologies that we care about are included in the distributions that matter to our customers. And I've kind of colored them here to help differentiate a little bit. The yellow stack is sort of the unusual collection, if you will. But fundamentally, there's sort of the Red Hat stream of consciousness that begins with the community distribution Fedora, which feeds technology into the development stream of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which then begets various derivative distributions, things like Oracle's Enterprise Linux, Scientific Linux, CentOS, and so forth. There's another sort of parallel but different ecosystem around SUSE. It's interesting that similarly to the Red Hat ecosystem, there's an OpenSUSE community-oriented distribution where lots of development and experimentation happens. It helps to feed technology into the SUSE Linux Enterprise server and desktop distributions. But there's frankly very little derivative distribution ecosystem downstream of that. I'm not terribly surprised. As was mentioned earlier, if you're going to create a derivative distribution in the open source world, one of the questions you have to ask is, what would you start with? And if you want to start with a commercial enterprise distribution, starting with a market share leader is not a difficult decision to make. So I'm not surprised that there are more derivatives of various kinds downstream of RHEL than there are of SLES. Both of those distributions, the Red Hat and the SUSE enterprise distributions, are completely technically competent distributions, and you can run them and have great success using them. You can get excellent support from companies like HP for doing so, but it's absolutely true that Red Hat has a substantial market share lead out there today, and that translates to a larger ISV ecosystem and things like that. Then there's Debian. Debian's different. Why is Debian different? There's no company there at all. And so there is no distinction between the community distribution and sort of the center of focus within that ecosystem. I may be just a little bit biased because after all, I've been involved in Debian for a very, very long time. But it is a documented fact that there are more derivatives of Debian than any other sort of place where distribution, creation, and aggregation happens, including some little ones you might have heard of, like Ubuntu.